This show is supported by Odoo. When you buy business software from lots of vendors, the costs add up and it gets complicated and confusing. Odoo solves this. It's a single company that sells a suite of enterprise apps that handles everything from accounting to inventory to sales. Odoo is all connected on a single platform in a simple and affordable way. You can save money without missing out on the features you need. Check out Odoo at odoo.com. That's odoo.com.
Crime may be one of the few aspects of life that we find both fascinating and terrifying. We're spellbound by a chilling murder mystery or a daring heist plotted out in books, TV, and movies. This interest in the illicit is as old as Adam. In fact, the Old Testament includes a murder in the 4th chapter of Genesis. Today's entertainment options reflect our fascination.
Ladies and gentlemen, the story you are about to see is true. The names have been changed to protect the innocent.
Crime shows have dominated television and radio going back nearly 100 years.
In the criminal justice system, the people are represented by two separate yet equally important groups.
And true crime ranks among the nation's most popular podcast genres.
This is criminal.
However, we are vigilant against actual crime in our neighborhoods and communities. We compile crime data with inconsistent applications, and we try to compare the numbers, although many jurisdictions do not participate. That data is cited to support a varying range of conclusions. We are told that crime nationwide is either going up or down. Crime data is confusing. For example, these conflicting accounts. First, we'll hear from Washington, D.C.'s Mayor, Muriel Bowser.
We know that crime has gone down in our city, and it has gone down precipitously over the last 2 years because of a lot of hard work, changes to our public safety ecosystem, including changes to the law. And we know that those facts don't comport to what some people are saying.
In fact, President Donald Trump has questioned the district's crime statistics.
The murder rate in Washington today is higher than that of Bogota, Colombia, Mexico City, some of the places that you hear about as being the worst places on earth, much higher. This is much higher. The number of car thefts has doubled over the past 5 years, and the number of carjackings has more than tripled. Murders in 2023 reached the highest rate probably ever. They say 25 years, but they don't know what that means.
So, who do you believe? Whether you're watching the nightly news or your favorite crime procedural, when it comes to crime statistics, the facts are not black and white. From West Virginia Public Broadcasting and PRX, this is Us and Them, the show that tells the stories about the things that divide us. I'm Trey Kay. Crime has been a central issue for President Donald Trump since he announced his candidacy in 2015. He called it out in his first inaugural address.
And the crime, and the gangs, and the drugs that have stolen too many lives and robbed our country of so much unrealized potential. This American carnage stops right here and stops right now.
At the beginning of his second term, President Trump sent a clear message that getting tough on crime was a top administrative priority. One of the measures he signed his first day in office was an executive order to restore the death penalty, which President Biden had placed under moratorium. In April, President Trump signed another executive order. Its title, Strengthening and Unleashing America's Law Enforcement to Pursue Criminals and Protect Innocent Citizens. This expands legal protections for law enforcement, equips local police with military assets, expands prison capacity, and a focus on uniform crime data. Trump also used so-called out-of-control crime numbers to deploy the National Guard to Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, and Memphis, and has also set his sights on other cities.
You look at Chicago, how bad it is. You look at Los Angeles, how bad it is. We have other cities that are very bad. New York has a problem.
But these deployments raise red flags for some people. Federal law prohibits the president from deploying National Guard troops for domestic policing.
And this will go further. We're starting very strongly with D.C., and we're going to clean it up real quick.
One of the Trump administration's most visible shows of force has been deploying immigration and customs agents, or ICE, to sweep up undocumented migrants. These deployments have faced widespread protests in Los Angeles, Portland, Oregon, and Chicago. Trump has responded with calls to use the National Guard to protect ICE agents and federal facilities from protests and violence. The Trump administration seems to suggest that all protesters are violent. In October, the president convened a roundtable on combating Antifa and what he calls left-wing radical terrorist groups. He was joined by members of his cabinet, including Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem.
Let's not make any mistake. These individuals do not just want to threaten our law enforcement officers, threaten our journalists, and the citizens of this country. They want to kill them. Their agenda is to destroy the American people and our way of life, and this president is standing in their way. He is stopping them from bringing their death and their destruction to the individual citizens in this country that just want to raise their kids and their grandkids in peace and in safety.
The Trump administration's show of force has echoes at the state level. State governments are increasing penalties with 3 strikes provisions and eliminating rehabilitation programs and other efforts to reduce prison populations. State leaders say their rationale for all of this is soaring crime rates. To help me think through how to consider crime statistics, I sat down with Jeffrey Butts, a research professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and director of the school's Research and Evaluation Center. He says we can think of crime in 3 categories.
One is our direct experience with it. So we or our family members have been victimized in some way, either through theft and having something stolen or being assaulted. That's the primary way I think that drives most of the emotions is personal experience. The second one is hearing about people we know or familiar with or who live nearby who have been victimized, and that also escalates the concern and anxiety about crime. And then the third one, which is truly unfortunate, is the cultural representations of crime. And I would even say the celebrations of crime and violence in popular media, movies, television, fiction. And that shapes the way I think politicians manipulate crime imagery for us because they know we respond to it because we've all seen the same movies and we all have those images in our mind.
Considering our interest in crime and its oversized role in our society, you might expect that crime statistics are uniformly reported and collected across the country. But that's not the case.
We know more about how many people bought eggs last quarter than we do how many robberies and burglaries occurred across the country. We have data. We keep track of commercial activity and purchasing and all the things that are part of the business cycle, because that's what people care about.
Why is that?
We don't have crime data because there's no one walking around with computers tabulating every time someone commits a crime. That doesn't exist. We have crime when someone sees a crime or calls the police and reports a crime, or when they themselves see a crime. And we call this reported crime, or in New York City, they're called crime complaints. Someone calls 911 and says there's someone trying to break into my car outside. That's a crime complaint, and that creates a data point. But that's not even the end, because then you don't have a data continuity unless someone is identified as that perpetrator and it leads to their arrest. That's arrest data, which is different than crime reports. And the fall off between reports and arrests can be more than 50%. So when I talk about crime data, if we wanted to assess the quality of life in a neighborhood in terms of public safety, you'd want to know how many people have experienced harm due to the illegal acts of other people. The only way to get that is to ask them. And there is something that does that. It's called the National Crime Victimization Survey. And other countries are so much better at this than we are. We have very spotty records of consistently implementing this crime victimization survey. And throughout my career, you think we're making progress, and then some new administration comes into the White House and says, we don't care about this, and they shut it down. And then all the researchers complain, and we have to get it going again. And we've never gone to the neighborhood level. So when I talk about surveys, we have a national survey, but how do you assess the effectiveness of the police department in Missoula, Montana, if all you have is a national number? And so we've never invested the resources we need to really track neighborhood safety from a resident's perspective at the local level.
Is there anything that can be done to give us more consistency?
So I started working with crime data full-time in the late 80s. And at that time, the one source we had for national level crime data was the FBI's Uniform Crime Reports, which you could pull up reports, I can still see them in my mind, from 1938, where police departments all over the country would contribute their counts. So a small town would say we had 3 burglaries and a robbery last quarter. Here you go. Here's what we know about it. All those reports would then be collected at the state level, and the state would send them into D.C., and they'd be tabulated as the Uniform Crime Report. That's a national number. That process was never satisfying to researchers because of all the inconsistencies. So in one town, they would say this is a felony robbery. And then you'd find out that that state legislator defined felony as anything that was more than $500. And the state next door defined it as $1,000. But all they would send you is here's how many felonies that occurred. And then the researchers would have to try to adjust for all these differences. And it was always complicated. And that's at the national level. And you'll see this in the media when they talk about crime trends. You don't see in the United States there were these many crimes. It'll say in the largest 30 cities of the United States, here's how many crimes there are. And you might think, well, that's okay, big cities, that's where crime occurs. But that's the problem. It misleads people into thinking that's where crime occurs.
Butts argues the spotlight on crime is focused unfairly on larger cities. Because of the inconsistencies in reporting, the media's concentration in urban areas, and how cities are depicted on television. An early example is this opening from a 1967 episode of the TV crime drama Dragnet.
This is the city, Los Angeles, California. It's a good place to live. We try to keep it that way. It's a full-time job. Every 60 seconds, a crime is committed in Los Angeles. In the Los Angeles Police Department's Communications Center, the telephone rings every 20 seconds, 24 hours a day. Of the 3 million people who live in Los Angeles, 35,000 of them are known rapists, murderers, and thieves. They outnumber the police force, 7 to 1. Every time a policeman answers a call, he takes a calculated risk. There'll always be somebody out there who doesn't like him and who might have a gun.
But Professor Butt says cities are safer than you might expect.
When you think about crime and the risk of crime as a probability of being harmed, you have to convert the count into a rate. And if you don't know what I mean, a rate is how many shootings per 100,000 population, how many deaths due to assault per 100,000 population, because that controls for the size of the population. Obviously, I'm here in New York City right now. There are 8 million people that live here. There will be more crime. But that doesn't mean that this is a more dangerous place than anywhere else. And in fact, if you look at the numbers around the country and control for population size, it's not hard to find small towns and counties that have higher rates of violent crime and higher rates of death due to violence than New York City, than the roughest parts of New York City. And I would point out to you, Actually, anyone listening, go to Google, ask Google to tell you the difference between rural and urban violence and crime and point out where it's worse. And you'll get a nice little listing of the counties with the highest rates of violent death. And many of them are in Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas, Oklahoma. And then you might start to see, as you get down into the 40th place, you might start to see places that you think of as the crime cities. And Americans don't realize this, that your chances of being harmed and being killed through a criminal act are higher in some really small towns in the South than they are in what we call big cities.
Okay, Google, what U.S. counties have the highest murder rate per 100,000 people? Okay, so this report by the Center for American Progress draws on data from the Centers for Disease Control. It lists the counties with the highest gun homicide rate, that is, per 100,000 people, between 2021 and 2024. 11 of the top 20 counties are rural counties, mostly in Mississippi and Alabama. Los Angeles County ranks 164th on that list, and Chicago's Cook County ranks 54th. So far, the president has not sent troops to any counties in Alabama and Mississippi. Some people suggest that Trump is more focused on the Democrat-led cities merely to make them appear ineffective or soft on crime, rather than addressing the actual high-crime counties in red states. Jeffrey Butts says there is some truth to this.
Politicians don't care about the crime issue. They want to use the crime issue. So they know that you get voters all stirred up and motivated by talking about crime in their community. And then someone like me comes in and starts saying, well, missing data, well, that's not accurate. And suddenly it becomes difficult to talk about crime. And the most logical reaction for that politician is to escort me out of the room, because they want to talk to their voters and use crime to energize people, whether they're from the left or the right. They use crime.
Both sides do that. You see that with regard to crime, that they kind of like there to be some type of vagary?
Both of them would say ending crime is their goal. But the left will talk about ending crime by building strong communities and listening to people, and they talk about lived experience all the time, and that's the expertise. You win an argument by saying, well, in my lived experience, this is what happens. It's all about the individual experience, which is valid. The other end of the political spectrum only wants to talk about police activity, and they imply that if you have crime, that's because you don't have enough police officers, or the police aren't supported well enough, and we need to add more policing, or even worse than that, the police need more technology and gear and equipment and more militaristic capacity. So both sides claim to know how to reduce crime, and they do that because of their voter base and how to motivate their own teams.
So since, as you said, there is no reliable repository of crime data on the local level, are state politicians left to just rely on their own anecdotes?
Yeah, which they love.
Days ago, a former member of the Doge staff was savagely beaten by a band of roving thugs after defending a young woman.
President Trump recounts some of the violent crimes in the nation's capital to justify deploying troops there.
In June, a 21-year-old congressional intern was tragically killed after being hit by a stray bullet in a drive-by shooting. A former Trump administration official named Mike Gill, fantastic person, was murdered last year in cold blood in a carjacking blocks away from the White House.
These individual anecdotes about violent crime can be tricky. They are, by design, shocking and horrendous. But they don't provide any context of crime trends over a period of time. That makes them useful for arguing that any crime is unacceptable, and therefore any response is justified. Coming up,
culture is just saturated with crime stories. Why wouldn't we be thinking about it all the time and being worried about it? But all that's different than the actual probability or the incidence of it happening to us or our families. And that's a hard thing to overcome when there's all these information sources that tell you, be scared, be frightened, it could happen any minute.
I'm Trey Kay, and you're listening to Us and Them. This program is supported in part with a grant from the Just Trust and the CRC Foundation.
In difficult times, music gives us peace, brings us together, and helps heal us. It calms our nerves and brightens our days. That's why we're bringing you classic episodes of Mountain Stage on air and in our podcast. This is Larry Gross, host of Mountain Stage. Find something that's familiar or brand new and feel the power of live music on our website, mountainstage.org.
Hey, it's Trey, and you're listening to Us and Them from PRX and West Virginia Public Broadcasting. Let's return to my recent conversation with Jeffrey Butts, research professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and director of the school's Research and Evaluation Center. We're looking at how the Trump administration uses crime rates to support dispatching National Guard troops and federal law enforcement agents across the U.S. The moves are part of the administration's reimagining of criminal justice reform. Criminal justice reform can take the form of focusing on rehabilitation or diversion programs, reducing sentences, overhauling criminal codes that reflect a different understanding on crime and punishment. And it can also take the opposite form, such as ending rehab programs, extending sentences, increasing penalties, overhauling criminal codes that take a firm, tough-on-crime approach. So, how are crime statistics wielded to bolster these two approaches?
Ineptly, unprofessionally, and malevolently, if I pronounce that correctly. I would say if anyone who holds elective office starts to explain to you the crime problem and then offers a crime solution, you smile and nod your head and say, thank you very much, that's interesting. And then you go find out what the facts are. Because people who hold elective office are rarely truthful on this issue. I used to think, because I've spent my life talking about crime and justice and public safety, that we were somehow singled out for misuse by politicians. But I think in the past, I'll say 6 months, I have learned that we are not unique. We are now seeing politicians misuse and basically lie to us about health and medicine and public health. And they are willing to do whatever they need to do to put on the show that they think makes voters motivated to attend rallies and pull the lever for them at the election. It doesn't matter what the issue is. I think crime probably is misused more because it's so highly visible. And as I said before, culturally, we focus on crime and violence, so it's an easier lever for them to pull to motivate us. So you use the word back and forth or pendulum swinging between administrations. Saying the word administration implies that government leaders who form a new government and come in, take power in the White House or the state capitol, the legislature, wherever, pursue an agenda which is designed to improve public safety. And they're not actually doing that. If they were concerned about public safety, they would be responsible consumers of the data, of facts and figures about what makes public safety, and they would try to implement policies that move those indicators in a positive direction. You rarely see that in a politician. They're not focused on public safety, they're focused on public reaction to the safety issue.
Okay, but I want to stick with the pendulum swing metaphor here. So what's your assessment of the current swing to a law and order or get tough on crime approach? Not just on the federal level, but across red and blue states.
Yeah. I'm sorry to keep telling you that you're misinformed, but the law and order framing, the tough on crime framing, those are political slogans that have nothing to do with their goals and objectives, the politicians. But you're right that the pendulum going back and forth, politicians from different parties have different approaches to appealing to their voters. And it was frustrating for me, having just lived through the Biden administration. They came into the White House full of that Democratic energy, and they funded a special White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention and spent a lot of money on what we now call CVI, Community Violence Intervention. It was a broad effort to improve public safety, but it was not guided by facts or research or empirical understanding. In fact, they often were hostile to that because they had their own mission.
And again, this was the Biden administration.
Yes. So the pendulum swinging is they wanted to attend to community dynamics and the experiences of the residents in those communities affected by violence, listen to the residents, work with the residents to make things better. But if you said, well, wait a minute, we tried that once and here are the results and we need to finesse this because it didn't work before, they would say, thank you very much and push you out because they had a mission to pursue. And talking about research and evaluation was a distraction. And I understand that. Researchers as a species can be really obnoxious because we're always focused on the findings of the latest study and the latest paper, and we like to dispute authority figures. And so I understand how once you're in a position of being responsible for government action,
it's supposed to do something.
Yes, supposed to do something, and your entire community is saying do something. You want to act. You don't want to say, well, let's appoint a commission and maybe get back to you in 3 years. You want to act.
That doesn't poll well.
Correct. And they know that. And that's what I mean by politicians are not sincerely trying to move the needle on public safety. They're trying to act in the interest of public safety and get a reaction from their voters.
So you were mentioning kind of an experience that you had with a wing of the Biden administration. The Trump administration is directing federal resources toward addressing crime in places like Washington, D.C., California, Tennessee, and perhaps Chicago and Baltimore. And his rationale is that crime in D.C. and L.A., for example, is out of control. And yet others have noted that the crime rates, specifically violent crime, is down. So what do you know about crime in D.C. and what's the reality of crime statistics for the nation's capital?
This administration, you said, is trying to, I forget what your phrase, trying to address the crime issue or bring down crime. They are not doing that. All the things you just mentioned about D.C. and Chicago and L.A. and using the National Guard, that is not either a response to the crime problem or an intervention designed to improve the crime problem. It has nothing to do with crime. It's public relations and political campaigning using the crime issue and using public safety to draw attention and motivate their base.
Okay, but has there been any measurable effect on crime in D.C. since the National Guard was deployed?
No. And when I say that as a researcher, when you use the term measurable effect, to me, that is a high standard of evidence. What politicians mean by that is what researchers would call pre-post difference. So I would say, if I were arguing for him, I would say, look at how many robberies there were in 2024. And look, there are fewer robberies in 2025. And then I would turn to the audience and raise my hands and say, yay, we did it. We brought down crime, which is complete BS. So any pre-post difference is raising a question, and for a researcher would suggest an avenue of investigation. It's never an answer. The fact that any indicator of crime is lower now than it was 6 months ago or 6 years ago is not evidence of the impact of anything that's been done to prevent crime. It's the crime numbers moving, but numbers move all the time. In fact, I would use the term fluctuate or vacillate. They go up and down. And what politicians do is wait for them to go down and then claim credit. Or they see them going up and point to their opponents and say, they did it. So again, anytime an elected official is talking about crime, you need to step back and reserve a healthy skepticism.
You've said that public policy isn't always informed by data and statistics, and that politicians have no interest in the veracity of crime data. And you've also said that the stronger connection is how crime statistics feed into political posturing, and that is used to motivate voters to create those policies. How and when do crime statistics matter?
So crime statistics matter because it's the only way we can track the incidence of the problem, compare jurisdictions, compare ourselves, for example, to another country. We know because of the prevalence of gun ownership in this country that our rate of gun violence is as bad as some of the worst beset countries in the world, and far higher than what politicians would call comparable developed nations. And that's useful. The international perspective is useful. And you only have that with consistent crime data. The other thing that's useful is historical perspective. So we talked about the fact that the homicide rate was much higher in the 1990s and has come down. The actual rate we're talking about is out of 100,000 people in a year, 9 people would be killed out of 100,000 people in the 90s, and now it's down to 4 and 5. So that's half as bad. But keep in mind, historically, we know it's hard to compile relevant data from more than a century ago because we didn't have the bureaucracies. But a researcher once looked at the records of churches in an area of England from, I think it was the 1600s or the 1700s, because churches is where people would note the fact that so-and-so died because their neighbors shot them or killed them. It's a rough estimate, but the estimate they came up with by looking at these records from a couple centuries ago in this town in England was homicide rates of 100 per 100,000. So 20 times worse than it is now. In this area of England, that's useful. So that's how crime data is relevant, to keep in mind this is a constant problem facing humanity, and we need public policies to address it. The challenge is which policies, how do we know they're working, and how do we keep developing more effective approaches? And right now, we are doing a very bad job of that.
Despite that, Americans' fear of crime has dropped 2 years in a row. A Gallup poll released last month shows 49% of people feel crime is a problem in the U.S. Last year, 56% of Americans felt crime was serious. The year before, 64% of Americans called crime in the U.S. an extremely or very serious issue. It was the highest number in 25 years. Even though crime statistics show a decline in violent crime in the recent years, many Americans still feel that crime is out of control. What do you think of this?
That's part of our, as I said, we celebrate crime and violence. We go to movies and watch TV shows, which are all about crime and violence. So we all hear about everything. I'm living in New York City. If some weird crime happens that results in someone's death in Lexington, Kentucky, I'm going to hear about it, and vice versa. So we all hear about crime all the time, and it's in the news all the time. Culture is just saturated with crime stories. Why wouldn't we be thinking about it all the time and being worried about it? But all that's different than the actual probability or the incidence of it happening to us or our families. And that's a hard thing to overcome when there's all these information sources that tell you, be scared, be frightened, it could happen any minute. It's hard to start talking about data.
But is this just the power of suggestion? I mean, if you keep telling people crime is out of control, even though they might not see it in their community, they believe it. I mean, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not saying that it's irrational for people to believe this. It's a rational response to the saturation of information that they're exposed to on a regular basis. It's just, wouldn't you hope that policymakers would have a different response to that?
Well, speaking of irrational responses, according to an Ipsos poll, 51% of Americans are absolutely terrified of sharks. And yet, in the U.S., only 1 to 2 people die every year from a shark attack. Is a fear of crime similarly skewed? I mean, are Americans just susceptible to the power of a movie or sensational news reports?
Yes.
The answer is that simple.
If you see anything that's portrayed in a way that is really horrifying and you can imagine yourself being exposed to that risk, it sticks with you. Jaws is that perfect example. We actually, now we're 50 years anniversary of the Jaws movie. How many people thought about that image as they walked into the surf to go swimming in the ocean? And it takes a long time for you to have enough experience with the ocean to set that aside. The same thing is true. I'm sure people visit New York City and they're told the subway's right there. And all those images come back to them about what happens on the subway. And they don't realize that it is a shark attack in terms of the probability and the incidence of it happening. But it's hard to put that out of your mind.
Well, let's imagine a utopian society where crime is at historic lows. And this wouldn't necessarily be ideal for law and order legislators. In other words, don't lawmakers need crime in order to make and to retain a tough on crime approach or posture?
I think that's almost more cynical than I am to say they actually need crime. I think they can't see past it. They can't imagine a world where it's not as bad as it is right now, which is shocking because one thing, the more visible and prominent you are in politics, the more likely it is that you've traveled internationally and been in other places where the public feels perfectly safe walking down the street in the middle of the night by themselves because the incidence of crime is so much lower. I don't know. I'm sure, given the range of behaviors we've seen recently among elected officials, that there probably are some who would fit that description you give me of they actually need it in order to use it. I think mostly they just can't imagine that anything they're doing would be effective, or they need to blame other people for it. But when you think about crime in the broadest sense, it's basically a person rejecting social norms, rejecting the things we expect of one another. So anyone who's raised a child knows that you don't have a 3-year-old who's instinctively generous and kind, and they learn that from their parents and from their school and from their friends and families. They learn how to be generous and how to be kind and how not to hurt other people. And it takes some time. Some people live in a world where they never are exposed to those lessons, and they're taught you got to watch out for yourself, you got to take what you can get, and to heck with those other people. And at 3, that means punching and kicking and maybe yelling. By the time that person's 15, they might own a firearm. And so they've lived in a world and had a life where they really don't care that much about other people. It's mostly about themselves and watching out for their group.
Again, this may go back to my cynicism here, but isn't the dependency, I guess, of crime to people who are tough on crime people, I mean, perhaps it's like abortion, which is a wedge issue, and they need people to have access to abortion in order to have something that motivates their base to get to the polls. Are you buying that analogy?
Yeah, because if you were having a sensible discussion, you'd say our goal is to prevent unwanted pregnancies and to prevent people from taking that into their own hands. So that means access to contraceptives, all the counseling and education, all the education and training you get about sexual behavior when you're young, that all that would be part of the response to abortion. But if you're an elected official who just wants to use that issue, you're only going to talk about they're killing the babies, and you use that imagery instead of seeing it as a health issue. And I think crime has analogies to that. It's a fair analogy because there's an emotional core to why people act the way they do and vote the way they do, and politicians know how to tap into that.
Crimes don't always follow a uniform path, and we all define safety differently. For some Americans, seeing National Guard troops and federal agents on the streets are signs that the government is getting tough on crime. For others, that same image is unsettling. Armed officers patrolling our cities make them look and feel more like war zones. The Trump administration points to crackdowns and troop deployments as evidence of restored law and order. However, public fear doesn't always align with violent crime statistics. A recent Gallup poll found that Americans worry most about becoming victims of identity theft or online scams. Nearly 70% say they fear that, while only 22% worry about being murdered. The fear of losing a child in a school shooting ranks heartbreakingly high at 43%. So even as President Trump says he's making our streets safer, the data suggests our anxieties live elsewhere, on screens, in scams, and in schools. The Trump administration's sweeping moves to redefine criminal justice and federal authority may shape our society for years to come. But safety isn't just about crime rates and political postures. It's about trust. Trust in our neighbors, in our institutions, and in one another. And that trust may be the hardest thing to restore. You've been listening to Us and Them. Our team for this show was me, Trey Kay, Mitch Hanley, and Kate Smith. Michael Lipton, Tristam Lozau, and Ahmed Solomon wrote and performed the Us and Them show music. Mark Lerner designed our logo. The marvelous people at PRX and West Virginia Public Broadcasting make Us and Them possible. So do grants from the CRC Foundation, and for this episode, the Just Trust. Hey, we'd love to hear your thoughts about this episode. Would you share them with us on our Facebook page or on X at Us Them Podcast? Us and Them was originally developed with assistance from the mentorship program at AIR, the Association of Independents in Radio. We'll see you next time on Us and Them.
Support for this podcast comes from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
From PRX.